There is something strange happening with the ancient records when you place them side by side with what is going on now in 2026. It is not that someone has discovered lost texts or translated some secret manuscript. It is that certain descriptions preserved for millennia have started to sound too familiar, as if whoever wrote them had seen our news. And when you realize that these descriptions do not speak of the past, but of a future that might be our present, things get strange. Why do texts so ancient seem to have anticipated exactly the type of confusion we are living through? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the time, because we are going to enter territory that many people prefer not to explore. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. There is a note preserved in an ancient manuscript that has always caught my attention. It is a translation of a phrase that, in later versions, appears like this: "No one knows the day nor the hour." It seems simple, but notice this detail. The phrase does not prohibit recognizing signs or understanding epochs. It only dismantles the obsession with exact dates. And this is important because when you join the fragments preserved about the end of times, what emerges is not a calendar but a pattern. A set of conditions that, according to these texts, would overlap before something decisive happened. What makes 2026 different is the sensation of convergence, as if various lines described in these manuscripts were lighting up together for the first time in history. First prophecy: the fall of the cornerstone. The first anchor of credibility for those who study prophecies begins with something that has already happened and can be verified historically. In preserved records of the words attributed to Jesus, there is a very specific description regarding the Temple of Jerusalem. The text says that he looked at that imposing construction and declared that there would not be left stone upon stone. Think about that for a second. We are talking about Herod's temple, one of the most impressive constructions of the ancient world. Stones that weighed hundreds of tons, an architecture that left visitors open-mouthed, the absolute center of religious and economic life for an entire civilization. To announce the complete destruction of that was not just prophecy, it was something that sounded impossible. Decades after the death of Jesus in 70 after Christ, the Roman legions of Titus surrounded Jerusalem. What happened next is documented even by non-Christian historians like Josephus. The temple was not merely destroyed, it was literally dismantled. The stones were removed one by one, exactly as described. Soldiers looked for melted gold between the cracks of the masonry, which forced them to separate each block. Notice the detail. It was not a partial destruction or a romantic ruin. It was a systematic dismantling that left the site empty. And this creates a psychological precedent for those who read prophecies. If this description fit with surgical precision into verifiable events, perhaps the others also deserve attention. Second prophecy: the return of the main pointer. In the ancient manuscripts, there are various references to a people who would be scattered to all nations and later gathered. The images used are interesting. They speak of a dispersion to the four winds and a regrouping from the ends of the earth. For centuries, this was read as metaphor or as something that applied only to the Babylonian period. But then something happens that no previous interpretation had anticipated. After almost 2,000 years without their own political territory, the Jewish people re-establish a national state. Not gradually, not as a result of a natural process of migration, but abruptly in 1948, by international decision, amidst a confluence of unique historical factors. What makes this prophetically relevant is not just the fact itself, but the context. The ancient texts associate this regrouping with the beginning of a countdown, as if Israel functioned as the most visible pointer of a cosmic clock. And when you look at the centrality of Jerusalem in contemporary geopolitical tensions, it becomes difficult to ignore that that territory has become exactly the type of symbolic weight described in the manuscripts. Any crisis in the Middle East passes through Jerusalem. Any rearrangement of alliances affects Israel. Any regional escalation places that small country in the center of the equation. It is as if the ancient text had identified the point of convergence for future conflicts. Third prophecy, the era of perfect deception. Here we enter a more disturbing territory. The preserved records speak repeatedly of a time marked by deception on an unprecedented scale. Not casual lies or common propaganda, but a type of confusion of reality that would make it difficult to distinguish truth from falsehood. A phrase that appears in various ancient versions says, "Take heed that no one deceives you." And right after comes a description that, read today, sounds almost like a prediction of the digital era. False messiahs, charismatic leaders promising salvation, signs and wonders that convince multitudes, and an atmosphere where even the most prepared become confused. What draws attention is that the text does not describe only religious deception. It speaks of an environment in which the very notion of truth becomes compromised. And when you look at 2026, deepfakes that are indistinguishable from reality, algorithms that create personalized informational bubbles, political and spiritual leaders who build alternative truths for their followers. The description no longer seems metaphorical. There is something more subtle there. The manuscripts suggest that this deception would not be obvious or crude. It would be seductive, intellectually satisfying, emotionally comforting. Exactly the type of thing that intelligent and well-intentioned people could accept, as if someone had anticipated the psychology of modern disinformation. Fourth prophecy, the cooling of love. One of the most specific descriptions found in the ancient texts speaks about a transformation in human nature. The preserved phrase says that the love of many will grow cold, and that iniquity will multiply. It is not just about an increase in criminality, it is about a change in the basic social fabric. What did this mean for those who wrote it? Perhaps they saw a future where people would become emotionally colder, more cynical, crueler to one another, where natural empathy would be eroded by some systemic process. And when you look at contemporary polarization, at the dehumanization that happens on social networks, at the ease with which entire groups are transformed into abstract enemies, the description gains contour. It is not that people have become evil in a caricatured way, it is that they seem to have lost something fundamental, the capacity to see humanity in those who think differently. The ancient records suggest that this would not be accidental. It would be part of a larger process, a psychological preparation to accept types of authoritarianism that healthy societies would reject automatically. Fifth, prophecy, the global birth pains. The preserved texts use a specific metaphor to describe the signs of the last times: birth pains. The image is intelligent because it captures two characteristics: increasing intensity and increasing frequency. The contractions get stronger and closer to one another until the moment of birth. Applied to world events, this suggests a pattern where wars, conflicts, and instabilities not only happen but become more frequent and more interconnected. The text does not demand that it be the greatest war of all time to be a sign. It demands that it be part of an accelerated and global pattern. When you map the conflicts of 2026, from tensions between great powers to regional wars that threaten to expand, passing through internal conflicts that destabilize entire countries, what impresses most is not the isolated intensity of each crisis, but the sensation that all are happening simultaneously, as if the world had lost the capacity to resolve one crisis before the next begins. And there is something more disturbing. Contemporary conflicts seem to have a different quality. They are not just traditional territorial or economic disputes. They involve identity, ideology, scarce resources, and technological changes that make any stability temporary. Sixth prophecy, convulsions in creation. Along with wars, the ancient records speak of signs in nature: earthquakes, famines, pestilences, and phenomena that would be interpreted as cosmic warnings. Here, caution is needed because earthquakes have always existed, diseases have always existed, climate changes have always happened. But the prophetic description does not speak of existence, It speaks of convergence and acceleration, as if in a certain period, various types of natural crisis happen together, creating a sensation that something is out of place in the functioning of the world. And when you add the data from 2026, extreme climate events that break historical records, disasters that force mass migrations, agricultural plagues that threaten global food security, earthquakes in sequence that destabilize entire regions. The impression is that nature is following a different script. What makes this prophetically relevant are not the scientific explanations of these phenomena, in which exist and are valid, but the psychological sensation they create. The impression that the world is becoming less predictable, less safe, less controllable. Exactly the type of environment that the ancient texts describe as preparation for fundamental changes. Seventh prophecy, the global witness. Among the conditions listed in the manuscripts for the end of the age, there is one that seemed impossible until recently. This gospel will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. For millennia, this was read as a distant goal or a metaphor. How would a small sect from the 1st century reach all nations? How would a message born in the Middle East cross oceans and linguistic barriers to reach peoples who did not even know they existed? But then come the 20th century and technological advances. First, radio, then television, then the internet. And more importantly, systematic projects of Bible translation into thousands of languages, organized missions that reach isolated tribes, satellite transmissions that cross political borders. What happened was not just geographic expansion of Christianity. It was the creation of the technical infrastructure to make a message reach literally anywhere on the planet. And when you look at contemporary statistics, how many languages already have biblical translation? How many regions have access to Christian content via the internet? How many countries have established Christian communities? The prophetic description no longer sounds like an impossibility. Notice the detail. The text does not say everyone will convert. It says it will be preached as a witness, as if the important thing were the opportunity to know the message, not the universal response to it. Eighth prophecy, the preparatory apostasy. One of the most uncomfortable descriptions preserved in the ancient texts speaks about what would be translated as apostasy, a departure from the faith that would happen within the religious communities themselves. Not external persecution, but internal corrosion. The pattern described is subtle. The religious language is maintained, but the content is diluted. The external forms remain, but the transforming power disappears. Leaders use the discourse of faith to build personal empires. Multitudes seek spiritual experiences, but flee from any real ethical requirement. And when you observe the contemporary religious scenario, mega churches that function as businesses, preachers who promise material prosperity, movements that transform faith into a consumer product, groups that use spirituality to validate political prejudices, the description gains contour. What makes this prophetically significant is that the text suggests that this apostasy would not be accidental. It would be a psychological preparation, as if by diluting authentic faith, a spiritual void were created that would be filled by something else. Ninth prophecy, the selective persecution. The preserved records speak of a time when genuine followers of the faith would be hated by all nations because of the name of Christ. Not a generalized persecution against all religions, but a specific hostility against a particular type of spiritual commitment. The pattern described is interesting. It would not be just physical violence, although that was also mentioned, but social pressure, marginalization, censorship, and exclusion from public spaces. As if certain convictions became socially unacceptable in societies that consider themselves tolerant. And when you map what is happening in 2026, Christians imprisoned for expressing certain beliefs in authoritarian countries, exclusion from academic and professional spaces in open societies for defending positions considered problematic, social media algorithms that suppress specific religious content. The pattern no longer sounds like paranoia. What draws attention is the specificity of the description. It would not be persecution against religion in general, but against a specific type of faith that refuses to adapt completely to the dominant values of each epoch. Before we enter the next prophecies, which get even more specific and disturbing, I need you to understand something. These records were not preserved as entertainment or philosophical speculation. They were preserved as practical warnings for people who would live through these times. The question is not whether everything will happen exactly as described, because the texts themselves warn against very literal interpretations of symbolic language. The question is whether we are living the type of convergence that these ancient manuscripts described as preparation for something greater. And when you join all these pieces, the return of Israel, the era of digital deception, the social cooling, the global conflicts, the natural convulsions, the religious apostasy, the selective persecution, and the worldwide witness. The impression is that someone millennia ago had seen our epoch and left a map. But it is not over yet, because the ancient texts speak of prophecies that have not yet been completely fulfilled. Events that, according to this tradition, would be the next in the sequence. And when you understand what comes next, you realize why so many people in 2026 feel that we are living not just through difficult times, but decisive times. Try to visualize what it means to be in the middle of a prophecy fulfilling itself in real time without knowing if you are seeing the beginning, the middle, or the end of the process. Follow along with me in the next part, because we are going to enter the events that these records describe as imminent. Those that many people believe could happen at any moment. And when you realize the type of change they would represent, you understand why the theme of prophecy ceased to be a religious curiosity and became an existential question. Now we enter the most disturbing territory of the ancient records. Because up to here we spoke of prophecies that already have some type of historical correspondence. Things you can verify, dates that can be checked, events that left a documentary mark. But there exists another set of descriptions preserved in these manuscripts that speaks of things that have not yet happened completely, or that perhaps are starting to happen now in 2026 in ways that no one had anticipated. The problem is that these prophecies are more specific, more detailed, more uncomfortable. And when you realize that some of the descriptions sound too familiar with our contemporary reality, you get that strange sensation of reading a script of the future written in the past. Notice this difference. The prophecies we have already analyzed speak of general patterns: deception, conflicts, social cooling. The ones we're going to see now speak of specific mechanisms, concrete systems, unique events. As if someone had seen not only the atmosphere of the last times, but also the mechanics of how they would function. 10th prophecy, the system of the mark. Among the most detailed descriptions preserved in the ancient manuscripts, there is one that has always generated intense debate. It speaks of a time when no one could buy nor sell without having a specific mark, not a different money or a new tax. A mark that would identify who has permission to participate in the economy. The preserved text is quite specific. The mark would be placed on the right hand or on the forehead, would be associated with a name or number, and without it the person would be excluded from the commercial system. For centuries, this was read as a technical impossibility. How do you control every purchase and sale? How do you monitor every individual transaction? How do you selectively exclude people from commerce? But when you look at 2026, the technical infrastructure already exists. Digital payments that replace physical money, biometric identification systems that use hand or face, algorithms that can block individual accounts instantly, central bank digital currencies being tested in various countries, social credit that connects behavior with economic access. What makes this prophetically relevant is not that we already have the mark, because the text suggests that this would be part of a larger system of political and religious control. It is that, for the first time in history, there exists the technical architecture to make function exactly the type of economic control described in the ancient manuscripts. And there's a disturbing detail. The records suggest that this system would not be imposed by brute force, but would be accepted voluntarily because it would offer convenience, security, and solution to real crises, as if people asked to be controlled. 11th prophecy, Babylon, the commercial city. In the preserved text, there is an extensive description of a city or system called Babylon that would dominate world trade. The images used are interesting. A city that gets rich selling luxury, that seduces the nations with its lifestyle, that controls trade routes, and that one day collapses suddenly. The description does not speak only of political or military power. It speaks of economic and cultural power, of a system that makes all nations dependent on its products, on its currency, on its standards. And it speaks of a fall that happens in 1 hour, something sudden that catches everyone by surprise. For a long time, this was interpreted as a historical reference to ancient Babylon, or symbolic of Rome. But when you look at the contemporary global economy, the worldwide dependence on centralized financial systems, the cultural uniformization through global products and brands, the vulnerability of national economies to decisions made in a few financial centers, the description gains a different contour. What draws attention is the specific list of products traded by this Babylon, from basic commodities to luxury items, including a strange phrase about souls of men, as if the system traded not only products but people, their attention, their data, their identity, their autonomy. And when you think of the contemporary digital economy, where personal data is the most valuable commodity, and where algorithms monetize human behavior, the phrase no longer sounds metaphorical. 12th prophecy, the Confederation of the North. Among the most specific prophecies preserved, there is one that describes a military alliance that would attack Israel in the last times. The text mentions ancient names of peoples and regions that many try to connect with contemporary nations. I will not enter into speculation about who would be who, because that always generates more confusion than clarity. But there is something interesting in the pattern described. A coalition that forms quickly, that catches everyone by surprise, that seems to have overwhelming military advantage, and that is defeated not by human force but by intervention, that the text describes as supernatural. What makes this relevant for 2026 are not the speculations about the identity of the nations, but the type of geopolitical scenario described. A world where alliances form and dissolve quickly, where small countries become proxies of great powers, where regional conflicts threaten to transform into world war. And there is a detail that many people note. The prophecy suggests that this coalition would attack Israel at a moment when the country was feeling safe, trusting in agreements and human alliances, as if the supernatural intervention happened exactly when the human solution failed. 13th prophecy, the rapture. Here we arrive at the prophecy that is perhaps the most known and the most controversial among Christians. The idea that before the final event, there would be a sudden removal of the true believers from the earth. The preserved text uses the image of people being taken while others are left, in the field, at work, in daily life. The description is quite specific. It would happen instantly, it would be global, it would be selective, and it would change everything from 1 hour to the next. Not a natural death or a gradual migration, thus a supernatural removal that would leave behind only those who had no genuine commitment to the faith. What makes this prophetically significant is not the mechanics of the event, which is impossible to explain in natural terms, but the timing described. According to this tradition, the rapture would happen when the world was in the type of condition we have already analyzed: generalized deception, growing conflicts, control system forming, society morally cold. And there is something disturbing in the logic. If this event really happened, it would remove exactly the people who still offered moral and spiritual resistance to the systems of control, as if after that nothing else prevented the consolidation of a global authoritarian power. 14th prophecy, the final charismatic leader. In the preserved records, there is a detailed description of a political leader who would arise during the last times. He is not described as an obvious villain or a caricatured dictator. He is described as someone charismatic, intelligent, a solver, who would offer answers to crises that no one else can resolve. The pattern is interesting. He would appear when the world was desperate for order, promises peace and security, would consolidate power, through crises, would use technology for total control, and would demand worship not only political, but religious. What draws attention is that the text suggests that this leader would not conquer power by force, but would be invited to assume authority by populations that would see in him the solution to their fears. As if the final dictatorship were democratic in the beginning. And when you look at 2026, the willingness of people to exchange freedom for security, the search for leaders who promise order amidst chaos, the ease with which surveillance technologies are accepted in the name of protection, it becomes clear that the world is psychologically prepared for exactly the type of leadership described in the ancient manuscripts. 15th prophecy, the image that speaks. One of the strangest descriptions preserved in the ancient texts speaks of an image created in honor of the political leader, which would have the capacity to speak and which would cause the death of whoever did not worship it. For centuries, this was impossible to interpret literally. But when you think of artificial intelligence, augmented reality, interactive holograms, and facial surveillance systems that can identify and track individuals, the description no longer sounds like fantasy. Imagine a system where a personalized AI of the political leader was present in all public spaces, could interact with individual people, identified who demonstrates adequate loyalty, and had the power to exclude dissidents from the economic system, or worse. The preserved text suggests that this image would be so convincing that it would deceive almost everyone, except those with specific spiritual discernment. As if the line between real and artificial became so thin that only people with a supernatural anchor could make the distinction. 16th prophecy, the mandatory digital economy. Returning to the economic system. The ancient records are specific about how the control of buying and selling would function. It would not be just a question of having or not having money, it would be a question of having permission to use the economic system. And there is a detail that always went unnoticed. The text suggests that this system would be introduced gradually as a response to legitimate crises. Perhaps it would start as a solution to monetary instability, or as a way to combat money laundering, or as an emergency measure during conflicts. What makes this prophetically relevant is that in 2026 we already see the building blocks. Countries testing central bank digital currencies, payment systems that can be turned off remotely, algorithms that analyze spending patterns to identify problematic behaviors, exclusion from financial services for ideological reasons. The prophecy does not demand that this happen overnight. It demands that a moment arrives when participation in the digital system becomes mandatory for economic survival. 17th prophecy, the Great Tribulation. The preserved texts speak of a specific period of 7 years divided into two halves, with the second half being described as Great Tribulation, a time of suffering unprecedented in human history. The descriptions include religious persecution on a global scale, natural disasters in sequence, economic collapse, wars that kill a third of humanity, and phenomena that affect the cosmos itself. Darkening of the sun, moon like blood, stars falling. What makes this prophetically significant is not just the intensity described, but the specificity. They are not vague descriptions of hard times. They are concrete images of specific types of civilizational collapse. And when you join this with our contemporary vulnerability, dependence on technology that can be turned off, global supply chains that can be broken, digital, financial systems that can be hacked, weapons that can destroy civilizations, you realize that we have the technical fragility to experience exactly the type of collapse described. 18th prophecy, the final battle. The climax of the preserved records describes a battle that would happen in a specific location in the Middle East, involving all the kings of the earth in a war against God himself. Not a war between human nations, but an attempt to resist supernatural intervention. The image is impressive. Armies of the whole world converging to a small region, using military technology that melts before a presence that the text describes as light brighter than the sun. What draws attention is the suggestion that this battle would be the logical result of everything that came before. The global control system, the charismatic leader, the rejection of faith, the persecution of believers. As if humanity reached a point of no return where it chose to resist even supernatural reality itself. 19th prophecy, signs in the cosmos. Among the most specific descriptions, there is a series of signs that would happen in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars before the final events. The text speaks of solar darkening, moon that gives no light, stars that fall, and powers of the heavens being shaken. For a long time, this was read as purely symbolic language. But when you consider our contemporary dependence on satellites for communication, GPS, internet, and financial systems, you realize that stars falling could have a very literal and very disruptive meaning. An intense solar storm, a cosmic event that affected our electronic infrastructure, or a coordinated attack on satellites could literally make the stars fall, from the point of view of those who depend on that technology for normal life. And there is something else. The texts suggest that these cosmic signs would be recognizable by people of different cultures as warnings of fundamental change, as if there were something universal in the language of the heavens. 20th prophecy, the final restoration. The end of the preserved records does not end in destruction, but in restoration. There are descriptions of a new type of world government, not based on human control, but on supernatural authority. An epoch where war becomes obsolete, where justice functions perfectly, where nature itself is restored. The images are specific: wolves grazing with lambs, children playing, with serpents, deserts blossoming, people living much longer, technology at the service of creation instead of destruction. What makes this prophetically relevant is that it is not just a vague, happy ending. It is a concrete description of what a civilization would be like where the fundamental problems of human nature, selfishness, corruption, death, scarcity, were resolved at the root. And there is an important detail. This restoration would not be the result of human evolution or technological progress. It would be the result of external intervention that would change the basic rules of reality. When you join all these prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled, the economic control system, the charismatic leader, the surveillance technology, the military confederation, the rapture, the tribulation, the final battle, and the restoration, what emerges is a specific script for the next events of human history. The question is not whether you believe it will happen exactly like this. The question is whether you recognize that we are living exactly the type of preparation that these ancient records described. The technical infrastructure, the psychological atmosphere, the civilizational vulnerability, and the desperate search for solutions that would make each of these events possible. And when you realize this, you understand why so many people in 2026 have the sensation of living not just a difficult epoch, but a decisive epoch. As if all previous human history were preparation for what is about to happen. Think about this. What if these ancient records were not just religious literature, but practical warnings left by someone who had access to information about the future? And what if 2026 were really the year in which the conditions finally aligned, so that these prophecies came off the paper and entered reality? But here is where things get really disturbing. Because it is one thing to read ancient descriptions about general patterns of the last times. Deception, conflicts, control systems. It is another thing to realize that specific events happening now in 2026 fit with surgical precision into details that were preserved millennia ago. I am not talking about forced interpretations or vague coincidences. I am talking about correspondences so specific that it is difficult to ignore. As if someone had seen our epoch in operation and left a detailed report disguised as ancient literature. And when you start to map these correspondences, you realize that they are not isolated events. They are pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, form exactly the scenario that the ancient records described as final preparation. First evidence: the money that disappears. In certain preserved manuscripts, there's a specific description about a time when people would not be able to buy nor sell without a specific mark. For centuries, this sounded like a technical impossibility. But notice what is happening now. China already has a social credit system functioning that connects individual behavior with access to services, including buying tickets, bank loans, and even internet speed. It is exactly the type of economic control based on conformity that the ancient text describes. Various countries are testing central bank digital currencies that would allow total control over every individual transaction. Not just monitoring, control. The capacity to block specific spending of specific people for specific reasons in real time. And there is something more subtle happening. The gradual elimination of physical money. Not by authoritarian decree, but by convenience. Cards, apps, digital payments have become so normal that many people already live weeks without touching physical money. What makes this prophetically significant is that it eliminates the last form of truly anonymous transaction. When every purchase and sale passes through centrally controlled digital systems, you have exactly the infrastructure necessary to implement the economic control described in the ancient texts. Second evidence, the surveillance that seduces. The preserved records speak of a time when it would be impossible to hide from authority. Not just difficult, impossible. And they speak of an image that would have the capacity to see and interact with people individually. When you look at 2026, the infrastructure already exists. Cameras with facial recognition in public spaces, microphones that capture conversations for artificial intelligence algorithms, domestic devices that monitor behavior, location tracking through cell phones. But the most disturbing thing is that people are asking to be watched. Virtual assistants that listen to conversations, apps that track health and mood, social networks that know more about individual preferences than one's own family. And now we have AI systems that can create realistic videos of people saying anything, interactive holograms that respond individually to each viewer, and algorithms that can predict future behavior based on past data. Imagine a system where a personalized artificial intelligence of the political leader was present in all digital, and physical spaces could recognize each person individually and had total access to the history of everyone's behavior. This is not science fiction. It is the logical extension of technology that already exists. Third evidence, the deception that convinces experts. In the ancient descriptions, there is a specific warning. The deception of the last times would be so sophisticated that, if possible, it would deceive even the chosen ones. Not obvious lies that only naive people would believe, but falsehoods so well constructed that even prepared people would become confused. And when you look at 2026, this is no longer hypothesis. Deepfakes that are indistinguishable from reality, algorithms that create convincing texts about any subject, disinformation systems that use artificial intelligence to personalize lies for each individual person. But there is something more subtle. The very notion of objective truth is being deconstructed. Not by academic philosophers, but by the structure of digital information. When each person lives in a personalized informational bubble created by algorithms, the idea of shared facts becomes obsolete. And we arrive at a point where intelligent, well-intentioned, and well-informed people can look at the same event and see completely different realities. Not due to difference of interpretation, but due to difference of access to basic information. This creates exactly the type of environment that the ancient texts describe, where spiritual discernment becomes more important than intellectual capacity to distinguish truth from deception. Fourth evidence, the unification that happens gradually. The preserved manuscripts speak of a world system that would control commerce, religion, and politics. For a long time, this was read as practical impossibility. How do you unite different cultures, different economies, different political systems? But notice what is happening gradually. Not a formal world government, but a global standardization of institutions, policies and values, international bodies that influence national legislation, trade agreements that limit sovereignty, economic pressures that force cultural conformity. And there is something interesting. This unification does not happen by military conquest, but by economic and cultural seduction. Countries adhere voluntarily to global systems because they need to participate to survive economically. The result is a world where national differences become increasingly superficial, while the structures of real power centralize in institutions that operate above elected governments. Fifth evidence: Israel as the clock pointer. Among the most specific prophecies, there are several that place Israel at the center of the final events, not just as a participant, but as a catalyst. And when you look at 2026, it is difficult to deny that this small country has turned into the point of convergence for global tensions. Any crisis in the Middle East passes through Israel. Any rearrangement of global alliances affects Israel. Any regional escalation places Israel in the center of the equation. It is as if the entire world geopolitical system revolved around a strip of land smaller than many Brazilian states. And there are specific developments that many people connect with detailed prophecies. Changes in the geography of the Dead Sea that some interpret as a harbinger of the living waters described in ancient texts. Agricultural advances in arid regions that others connect with prophecies about the desert blossoming. Archaeological discoveries that reinforce the historical centrality of Jerusalem. More important than the specific events is the pattern. Israel has become exactly the type of symbolic weight that the ancient text described. A small country that affects the whole world. Sixth evidence: the apostasy that grows from within. The preserved records describe a specific type of religious corruption that would happen in the last times. Not external persecution that forces churches to hide, but internal corrosion that maintains the forms while emptying the content. And when you map the contemporary religious scenario, you find exactly this pattern. Mega churches that function as companies, preachers who sell material prosperity, movements that use the language of faith to build personal empires, denominations that adapt basic doctrine to please cultural pressures. The result is a Christianity that is often indistinguishable from self-help, positive thinking, or political activism. It maintains the religious vocabulary but loses the capacity for real transformation. This creates exactly the type of spiritual void that the ancient texts suggest would be filled by something else. An alternative spirituality that would offer experience without real ethical requirement. Seventh evidence: the selective persecution in free societies. One of the most specific descriptions in the ancient manuscripts speaks of a time when genuine followers of the faith would be hated by all nations because of the name of Christ. Not all religions, specifically those committed to Christ. And when you map what is happening globally, you find an interesting pattern. General tolerance for spirituality and specific hostility for Christianity that refuses to adapt completely to dominant values. In authoritarian countries, this appears as explicit persecution, arrests, closing of churches, prohibition of religious activities. In open societies, it appears as social pressure, professional exclusion, cultural marginalization, and, increasingly, legal consequences for expressing certain convictions. What makes this prophetically significant is the specificity. It is not hostility against religion in general, but against a specific type of commitment that refuses to make fundamental concessions. Eighth evidence: nature in convulsion. The preserved texts speak of signs in nature that would be recognized as warnings of fundamental change. Not just isolated natural disasters, but patterns that would create a global sensation that something is different in the functioning of the world. And when you look at 2026, the list is impressive. Climate events that break all historical records, fires that consume entire regions, floods in places that never flooded, droughts that transform landscapes, earthquakes in sequence that destabilize regions, agricultural plagues that threaten food security. Individually, each of these phenomena has a valid scientific explanation. Collectively, they create exactly the type of atmosphere that the ancient manuscripts describe. The sensation that the world is becoming less stable, less predictable, less safe. And there is something else. These events are forcing mass migrations, creating climate refugees, destabilizing regional economies, and creating exactly the type of social instability that the ancient texts associate with preparation for fundamental political changes. Ninth evidence: the generation that would not pass. Among the most intriguing phrases preserved in the ancient records, there is one that says that the generation that saw these signs would not pass before the complete fulfillment of the prophecies. Not the generation that was born after the signs, but the one that witnessed the beginning of the pattern. This has always generated debate about chronology. Which generation? When did the signs begin? How long does a generation last? But there is something interesting. If you consider that the specific signs began with the return of Israel as a nation in 1948, and if you define generation as the period of a normal life of a person, we arrive at a temporal window that includes 2026. It is not an exact calculation, and because the text itself prohibits marking a specific date. But it is an observation that we are in an epoch where this phrase begins to have practical urgency that it did not have before. 10th evidence, yes, the psychological preparation. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence is psychological. The ancient records describe a specific mental state that would dominate people in the last times. Fear, confusion, willingness to exchange freedom for security, desperate search for strong leadership. And when you look at 2026, you find exactly this atmosphere. Entire populations willing to accept surveillance in the name of security, control systems in the name of convenience, limitation of freedoms in the name of protection. It did not happen by direct coercion, but by the creation of an environment where people ask to be controlled. Real crises that generate genuine fear, which generates willingness to accept solutions that, in normal times, would be rejected as authoritarianism. It is exactly the type of psychological preparation that the ancient texts suggest would be necessary for people to accept the type of global system they describe. When you join all these specific evidences, the infrastructure for total economic control, seductive surveillance technology, sophisticated deception, gradual global unification, Israel as catalyst, religious apostasy, selective persecution, natural convulsions, and psychological preparation, what emerges is not speculation about the future, but documentation of the present. The question is no longer whether the conditions described in the ancient records are possible. They already exist. The question is whether we are seeing only preparation for future events, or if we are seeing the beginning of the events themselves. And when you realize this, you understand why so many people feel that 2026 is not just another difficult year, but a decisive year. As if all the preparation had finished, and now it was time for the main events to begin.